Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this workshop. We are thrilled to have you join us today for this workshop for a special issue in the Journal of Business Research on a strength-based approach to customer vulnerability. And the special issue, I have the honor and pleasure to guest edit with Professor Rebekah Russell-Bennett and Professor Sertan Kabadayi. And in this workshop, we will tell you a little more about the special issue, and I will pass it on to Rebekah, who will give us a little bit of an agenda of this workshop.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Linda. Linda, can you hear me? Just let me know.
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks. All right, well, welcome, everybody. I was very pleased to be able to be part of this special issue. When Sertan sort of first reached out and made the suggestion, I thought, what a great idea to actually do an entire special issue on the strengths-based approach. And I'm really pleased that the Journal of Business Research agreed, and here we are. So I'm going to be the clicker person for the PowerPoint. While we wait for people as they all arrive, you might want to pop into the chat and just say hello to the group in the chat and say where you're from, just to give us a bit of an idea about the cities and countries that we've got represented here of people showing their interest. Okay, so what we're going to be going through is, I'm doing the overview now. We're going to talk about what is a strengths-based approach to customer vulnerability. We're then going to talk about the difference between strengths-based and deficit-based approaches. Then we're going to talk about why it's important to adopt a strengths-based approach in service research and practice. Then we're going to get, I guess, down to the business end of the webinar, and that is what is the scope of the special issue. What are the kind of topics that we're interested in receiving submissions on, and then the details around the journal submission guidelines and process. Now, throughout the webinar, please feel free to pop questions into the chat. We will go through those first when we get to the end of the webinar. And then we can, of course, take live questions with people unmuting their microphone. But we're not sure how many people we're going to have online. So I'd sort of encourage you to put your questions into the chat, and we'll go through those after we've done, I guess, the formal part. So first of all, what is a strengths-based approach to customer vulnerability? And you can see a QR code there. The QR codes will appear throughout the session. Basically, that will take you to the call for papers details on the Journal of Business Research website. And so if you want to have a look at that as we're talking, please click on that QR code, or you can, of course, Google Journal of Business Research call for papers, and it will appear there as well. Okay, so first of all, just I guess a bit of a preamble here about how our brains work and why our brains seem to like going to deficit type language. So first of all, the way that our brains work is that we like to label people. It allows us to sort and classify and to know whether or not people are friend or foe. And what this means typically is that we put the characteristic first. Now, this is called identity first language. So, for instance, homeless person or alcohol abuser. So they're the kind of languages that we're familiar with. Vulnerable consumer is one that we see a lot in the literature. The problem with putting the characteristics first is that we're in fact labeling a person, and we're making an assumption then that the state that they're in is actually part of who they are. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. The alternate way that we can use terminology is we can label the context. And so this is basically putting the person before the condition. So an example is, instead of saying homeless person, we say a person experiencing homelessness. Now, I know it's a lot wordier. It is clunky and it is longer. But there's a very important difference in the way that we use those words. And again, I will share that with you in a moment. And so the first thing I guess I'd like you to think about yourself is, how do you refer to people? Do you label the person or do you label the situation? And that's really a bit of a self-check. And I know for me, I used to label the person all the time. I labeled people as vulnerable consumers. And it wasn't until I started working with people who do research with First Nations or Indigenous people in particular, and people working with those who experience disability, that actually I had it pointed out to me that a more appropriate term is to label the context, not label the person. Now, the caveat here is some communities do actually prefer identity or condition first language. So you'll find that some people do refer to themselves as an autistic person, whereas others say a person with autism. So it's really important to understand when working with people experiencing vulnerability, what is the terminology that they in fact use to refer to themselves. And that can be a very tricky situation, but you do need to know what that is. And it's important that when we publish on these areas, bearing in mind, we're not health professionals, we're services marketers, that we upfront indicate the language that we're using and why we're using it. So for instance, if you choose to label the person, it may well be because that is how the community self-identifies. And so I would include that early in my article, whereas my default now is actually labeling the situation. So I always say customer or consumer experiencing vulnerability. I never say vulnerable consumer or vulnerable customer. So it's really important that we classify the circumstance and not the characteristic. And one of the reasons for that is that when you use person first language, that is a person experiencing homelessness, you actually see the person first, and it shifts the focus from the condition to the person. And so we want person-centered research. And the only way we can do that is to use person-first language. We also know, and there's been some really good research by Udemy and Reed. And in fact, if you Google those two authors, you'll find a whole bunch of really, really good academic research. And this is outside of marketing, by the way. Their research shows that people perceive person-first language as less offensive. So if you say a person experiencing homelessness or a person using drugs, it is less offensive than saying drug user or homeless person. And we want to be respectful in the way that we conduct our research. So for a whole variety of reasons, we should say consumers or customers experiencing vulnerability, not vulnerable consumers. So I want to talk now a little bit about why we tend to like, why we're hardwired for the negative. And so this is now moving into our discussion around deficit and strengths-based. So effectively, our brains are hardwired to see negatives and to use negatives. We know that people complain more than they give compliments. And there's a good reason for this. We're actually hardwired biologically to pay attention to danger and risk. It allows us to act faster. And so we spot the danger before we actually see the safety. It's one of the reasons why the color red is used so predominantly in branding. Red is associated with danger, and red actually pops out to us when we visually look at colors. And it's why we see red used a lot in branding, because those logos and those brands appear or are recognized by us, what we first see when we look at a supermarket aisle. We also know that the role of governments, particularly historically, has been paternalistic. It's the role of governments in many websites is to help us, to save us from harm. So it's very harm focused. And the traditional role of government has been seen as a protector and provider. And one of the things here is it's about a helping role rather than a facilitating role. And often it's about filling those deficits or saving people from themselves or saving those people over there. Now, what's really important here about a strengths-based approach is that it is person first. And one of the reasons for this, one of the reasons that I use this, is because there's been some really good research in the psychology area that shows that when we say words like homeless people, what it does is the person who hears that actually develops a belief that the condition is permanent, it can't be changed. There's something that goes on in our brain that when we hear an identity first label like homeless person, we perceive it's intractable, can't be changed, which reduces the will to actually do something about it. I think for me, the second one is even more important. we have different beliefs about who is responsible for the problem, simply based on whether we say homeless person or whether we say person experiencing homeless. So if we say homeless person, the belief that sits behind that is that the condition is in the person's control and they're simply not willing to change. So not only is it permanent, it's also their fault. And simply by using language such as a person experiencing homelessness or a person experiencing vulnerability, we immediately have a different set of beliefs that can sit behind that. So I think that's really important when we're dealing with trying to develop strategies or transformative service initiatives or policy and programs. We need the public will to support that. If people believe that a person is experiencing vulnerability through their own fault and it cannot be changed, then you can see how that might affect voting intentions, political will, but also the support to do something that is actually community-based. So it's the role of language here is really important, and language shapes markets. So we need to be very, very conscious of the language we use and steer away from either overly negative or in particular, steer away from identity-first language. So moving then into vulnerability research, and I'm going to skip through this reasonably quickly. The first sort of occurrence or interest really about consumer vulnerability appeared in the 1990s by Andreas and Manning, and it looked at dissatisfaction and complaint behaviour. Then we can fast forward to 1997, where we start to see the emergence in the literature of targeting strategies for vulnerable customers. And again, we're seeing the language here. It's vulnerable coming before the word consumer. We then see the Baker paper. So most of us who research in this area are very familiar with this seminal paper by Baker, Gentry and Rittenberg. And it was the first framework that actually starts putting together what some of the contributing factors might be to consumer vulnerability. And importantly, this paper shifted the focus from who experiences to vulnerability to what constitutes consumer vulnerability. And we see our first major definition in the literature. Now, 2010 comes along. There's Adkins and Jay do a bit of an amendment on the Baker et al. Paper, and they introduce market imbalances. 2013, we see TSR emerging, and the centrality of addressing consumer vulnerability for wellbeing really is launched in that paper. And then we've seen a plethora of papers. There's something like over 300 publications now in the area of consumer vulnerability or customer vulnerability. Journal of Services Marketing has the first special issue on consumer vulnerability in 2017. And then in 2022, Journal of Services Marketing also has the first consensus definition that was a systematic literature review by Riddell and colleagues that put together a consensus definition. Now, while it's great to see that evolution, what I can see in all of that is it's still often using the term vulnerable consumer. Sometimes people say consumers experiencing vulnerability. There's a bit of a mixture in the literature. For this special issue, we do require the terminology of customers or consumers experiencing vulnerability. Now, what's also apparent here is that this is really deficit language. It's about powerlessness. It's about consumers being recipients and passive recipients of what's happening in the market. And so in 2022, there's a new strengths-based definition of customer or consumer vulnerability that myself and colleagues put forward. And we did this to address previous definitions that did use the deficit framing. And the problem with deficit framing is that it problematizes the behavior as atypical. It's not something that everybody experiences. It's something for that group over there. It positions vulnerability as a trait or as an individual characteristics. So therefore, if it's inherent in a person, then it can't be changed, right? It often reflects the gaze from a privileged position, and that amplifies the deficit tone, and we have to help those poor unfortunates over there. It also reinforces the powerlessness, and it reduces implied agency. Now, what the other observation that we've had is that past definitions conflate hardship with vulnerability. So vulnerability is a susceptibility. It's not an actual hardship state. You haven't hit that yet. So if you are if you are experiencing homelessness, that is hardship right now. You've passed the vulnerability stage. And so what's really important in papers is that you really clearly delineate between being in a state of harm or in a state of hardship versus the preceding stage, which is actually the vulnerability stage. And one of the things we've also done is broaden the term from consumer to customer to be more inclusive of various people who are in the process. So it's not simply an individual, it could be their families or their support people or their communities. And so customer is a more inclusive term. And so the definition, the only definition that is a strengths-based definition of consumer or customer vulnerability is Russell-Bennett, Russell-Bennett, myself, and Kate Leatherin in the Journal of Marketing Management. And so you can see there that it's not about powerlessness. It's all about perceptions of susceptibility where it can give rise to greater resilience and strength. So what are the differences between strengths-based and deficit approaches? Well, essentially, traditional deficit approaches to people experiencing vulnerability focuses on what people lack that needs filling. It's often passive, which means it's disempowering or even potentially victimizing. This often leads to paternalistic interventions where solutions are designed for people. And if you're unsure about whether or not, this reflects what other people actually do in the field, go and have a look at social science, go and look at health, go and look at domestic violence literature, go and look at education, look at criminology, look at justice. All of these literatures have advocating for a strengths-based, not a deficit approach, and they've been doing it for about 2 decades. And so in marketing, we've only just caught up with the people who are actually out in the field developing these interventions. And so that's what this special issue is about, is helping catch up a bit. So a strengths-based approach focuses on what people have that can be leveraged. It doesn't minimize the challenge, and it doesn't say that everything's peachy. It basically says there are strengths in the service ecosystem that can be leveraged to overcome the problem. It is empowering, it gives agency, and it leads to people-led interventions where solutions are designed with customers, not for customers. So an example here is a program that we did for the Women's Butterfly Project, looking at helping mature women maintain secure housing. And so what we had to do is develop a glossary to change some of the deficit-based language that we were using, that the housing sector was using, into strengths-based languages. And this is a project we worked with the Department of Housing on. They were pretty blown away by this, and they've gone back and actually altered a number of the practices that they do to be more strengths-based when we did this work with them. We will be circulating these PowerPoints, so I'm not going to go through all the details, but you can see instead of saying the word homeless, it's experiencing housing stress. Instead of saying fix, we use terms like support. We don't use language like at risk. And that's particularly important in this area because a lot of people who are potentially experiencing housing stress actually don't see that they're at risk. They don't use that kind of language. And so we're using the language that consumers actually themselves use. So in our project, we found that we had to constantly reorient the features, and it was hard for me in particular, to get out of that deficit mindset. So initially our project title was Preventing Homelessness. We changed that to being about maintaining secure housing. We did a set of design principles, and you can see it's deficit. It's about removing barriers. We actually changed that to being about leveraging strengths. We had persona profiles that talked about a lack of or loss of or missing. It focused on barriers, and it was a risk profile. And we changed that to being a strength profile, a focus on the benefits and the motivators. We had a quiz that went along with it. Again, that there was risk likelihood. We had a really serious tone and negative emotions and experiences coming through. And so we ended up changing that to having a more uplifting tone, stability, likelihood, and positive experiences. We changed the language around tools. We were referring to resources, and in fact, we changed that to focus on capabilities. And that's another key term, is resources and capabilities are 2 different things. And so we've seen a real shift, particularly in the TSR literature, with a focus on human capabilities rather than on resources. And there's a paper in Journal of Service Research by Ray Fisk and colleagues on the digital divide that explains a little bit about this, that also focuses on capability. So I'd really strongly recommend that people focus on capabilities rather than focusing on resources. So I'm going to hand over now to Sertan, who's going to talk about why adopting strengths-based service approaches in service research and practice. And Sertan, when you're ready for me to click, just say next.
Thank you, Rebekah. So I will just summarize what some of the main points that Rebekah mentioned. Then I will try to bring it to the service research in my section. Next, please. So as we mentioned, when we say strength-based research, especially in service context, our research need to adopt an empowerment orientation that focuses on community, individual strengths, resources, but more than that, capabilities, relationships, and activities as well. So when we do that in our project, we need to have an intentional focus on including measures and tools that seek to understand the strength of the people or the populations. And I think one important thing from the Hammond paper 2010, our research, we need to start with what's right with people question. Instead of what's wrong, what is missing, how can we help? The first question should be what's right with people so that we can take it from there. Next, please. And again, as we mentioned, it's very important for us to make sure that we have that strength-based approach in papers that will be submitted to this special issue, so that we need to have research questions that lead to empowerment, growth, positivity, beyond just like focusing on the problems and fixing the problems themselves. We can just go a couple of next, maybe. And again, we focus on the capabilities and strengths in this paper. And another important thing when it comes to strength-based research is to adopt a participatory approach and do research with and by instead of about the individuals or groups. Remember that we are not just there to help them to fix their problems, but also we are there to listen to them and we take it from there. It's important to have that language which is person-centered and optimistic. Again, we are trying to avoid to put the blame on the people for whatever vulnerabilities that they're experiencing. Another important thing when it comes to strength-based research is identify and understand and study the social context. What creates those vulnerabilities that the people are experiencing? It's very important. I mean, no need to say that, but then again, you know, we need to engage research participants with respect so that they can offer and share their own expertise about their situation, that we do the research with them instead of about them. So creating that collaboration with the participants is very critical when it comes to create some evidence-based interventions to help with those vulnerabilities. Next, please. So in terms of methodology, both qualitative and mixed methods are important in strength-based research, especially integration of qualitative and quantitative components to using mixed method research. It increases the meaning, relevancy, and understanding of the context that kind of help us understand vulnerabilities and how people can use their strength and their capabilities to overcome those vulnerabilities. Again, in those questions, what is working well for you this moment? What do you think you do well? What connections do you have in your community? So again, we start with that positive questions and positive attitude in those cases to generate our research and research questions. Next, please. Next. This is, I mean, Rebekah is really one of the pioneers, I think, when it comes to using strength-based approach, especially in marketing, especially in service research. This paper, one of her recent papers, Russell-Bennett et al., 2023, this is, in this paper, Rebekah and her co-authors, they talk about the 5R guidelines. So I highly recommend you to go and check out that paper, because those 5 Rs, they reframe the issue label. Again, they don't put the blame on the people. They relate to the client. They relate to the people that they are studying with. They revise the language, and then I think in the paper, they mentioned that the rewiring the brain through reflection can be challenging, but is definitely required. And as a result, they also offer a redesigning the methods to reflect strength-based approach. Again, it's kind of hard to talk about someone's paper when that someone is just on the screen, but I hope I'm doing justice to the paper. It's a great paper, by the way. Rebekah, please, next. So we try to create some checklists for strength-based approach. So before you submit your paper for this special issue, but I think we believe that for any research that involves vulnerabilities that people experience, these are some of the questions that you may want to ask yourself. Does your research tend to place the blame on the participants? If yes, probably it means you are using deficit-based approach. Or does your research label the person or group as vulnerable? That's what Rebekah mentioned before. Put the person first versus put the context. Does your research consider the larger systemic context? This is another important thing, that we can all be vulnerable depending on the context, depending on the situation. So it's very important to understand that larger systemic context. Sometimes not intentionally, but unintentionally, your research can contribute to negative, pervasive, and implicit beliefs about the participants. Again, we have to be aware of those situations, and we have to have that check on our research. Does your research, again, unintentionally reinforce negative hegemonic systems or thinking? Again, as Rebekah mentioned, starting with the governments and many organizations with all good intentions, in fact, at the end of the day, they contribute to the systems that create those vulnerabilities. So we have to have some check on that as well. And the last thing is very important, and now I also start using this, the importance of language in my even classes, in my teaching as well. And let me tell you, it really gets students' attention when you have those examples next to each other, so that they understand the importance of language, that homeless person versus person experiencing housing problem are two different things, so that the language that you use in your entire paper is important when it comes to strength-based approach as well. Next. So when it comes to the special issue, can you next, Rebekah? I'm almost done with my section, but we really hope to receive multidisciplinary collection of papers. Even though we three of us, we are service researchers, we hope that we will get research from other business or social science disciplines as well. As Rebekah mentioned, strength-based approach has a long history in nursing, in education, in other fields, so that we hope that we will receive papers that draw on literature from those other disciplines. And in fact, we will give them priority if they're just coming outside of business research. We hope to receive conceptual work, but as long as it offers a critical synthesis and new insights, instead of just having a bibliometric or literature review articles. And finally, we hope to get papers submitted that consider environmental factors affecting vulnerabilities. And when we say that, especially the role of the service ecosystems and contextual factors, papers that address them would be well received in this special issue. Next. And I think I leave it to Linda to take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebekah and Sertan. Thank you for the great introduction. And I believe we already kind of gave you a little bit of a overview of various topics and direction where this special issue might take all of us together. And here are some potential topics we reflected on. So as mentioned by both Sertan and Rebekah, we do need more foundational insights to understand the strength-based approach in the service setting. So more conceptualization of the strength-based approach in service research, trying to understand its effectiveness, its impact, in the unique service settings that we work within, but also the strategic application. How can we design and deliver transformative service initiatives with a strength-based approach? How can we practice TSIs, transformative service initiatives, in different service contexts, and with the contexts influence the way the strength-based approach is applied in one context versus the other. But also practical application. As you notice through a lot of the examples that have been shared so far, a lot of the strength-based examples are very practical and they can be really translated into practice. So we would love to see also some real practical applications of how did the strength-based approach change or contributed to a positive change in a service organization, an NGO, in a service setting per se. Also, as Sertan mentioned, we touched upon on the ecosystem perspective, but also on the cultural dimensions, right? There's a lot of cultural differences in the way we talk and the way we express ourselves. Some cultures could be more prone to be more in tune with a strength-based approach, while other cultures might see that as maybe too wordy or too formal or too complex for a specific situation. So it'd be really interesting to see cultural differences and dynamics as to how different cultures reflect and practice the strength-based approach within their service ecosystems. We also thought about the idea that strength-based approach, most likely for it to work, it would need to be practiced on a more of a broader service ecosystem as opposed to one actor per se in a specific context. So how can we take this context, this idea that is not very easy to touch upon, and broaden it, right? Scale it up across different layers of a service ecosystem. But also back to what Sertan mentioned, some methodological perspective, right? Exploring some enablers, some barriers, and also what kind of methodologies do we need to do? How can we change our own methodologies, especially if we're conducting more of a qualitative perspective or even more type of an action research in the specific type of work? How can we adapt our methodologies into adopting more of a strength-based approach? Next, please. Thank you. But also looking at our own service constructs, the ones we've been studying throughout the years, as to how can we look at them maybe differently or add to them or enrich our own kind of a background of service knowledge with new understanding of the language and the role of language in these contexts. So kind of adopting more of a critical marketing perspective and looking at some of our established service context or concepts from a strength-based approach. Of course, back to what has been said also earlier, it's a very interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary topic that we're bringing in here. A lot of people, when we first started talking about that strength-based approach, were wondering, what are we talking about? But then, as research shows, again, it's a very popular and it's growing in practice in other fields. So we do think there's a lot of application in our own research and our own practices as well. So bringing those theories in, bringing those examples and bringing those contexts from other disciplines that are most likely doing better than us in practicing the strength-based approach. Also, very important application for sustainability and social impact. As we all know, this is becoming a really important topic in service research and marketing and business in general. So how can we infuse all the research on sustainability and social impact with a strength-based approach? How can we infuse TSR, a topic very dear to my heart? How can we infuse our work in TSR with more of a strength-based approaches into the uplifting of the well-being that we talk about in TSR, but also back to the language element with the communication and engagement, right? So how can we leverage the strength-based approach in our communication and marketing communication in general? We're seeing, of course, the usage of social media and all the various type of marketing communication that has been changing over the years. Where can the strength-based approach be implemented across the communication strategy of organizations, and how can we engage customers with this type of language and this type of practices? And this is just a short overview. We also provide a couple of resources. Thank you, Rebekah. Next. Thank you. A couple of resources. These are also listed in the call for papers. So a couple of resources I wanted to highlight here to just kind of highlight your attention to them. There's a useful guide for understanding what a strength-based approach is, developed by Hammond and Zimmerman, and where they actually outline 9 principles and a language glossary. So it's also kind of a checklist to check if we're using the right language. There's also a collection, a really nice collection of case studies that are actually using a strength-based approach, and has been collected through a symposium that was organized in 2023 in Australia under the theme of strength-based approach. There's also a number of resources that are collected by the UK Social Care Institute for Excellence. So again, showing that this is gaining more popularity across different countries and different areas, and also positive psychology, which obviously by theme and topic nicely aligns with what we're talking about here. So there is a free toolkit there. And again, you can see all these resources in the call for papers. Next, please, Rebekah. And finally, one thought we had is that we don't want to limit the questions or the potential way we can take this to whatever the 3 of us were able to think about. But we really encourage you to get inspired from the nature around us. And lately, I've been doing more research on trying to look into what can we learn from nature in our own kind of practices and service research. And if you look at some of the examples that we included here, a lot of them are very positive and uplifting, right? A mother care for her children, a volunteering experience, the way it makes people feel. What can we learn from nature, and how can nature is already nurtured in an environment that kind of builds on strength and strength. So there's so much going on around us that we can get inspired from, hopefully get ideas, make some analogies, create some connections between bridges that we didn't see before. So we hope the world will be your biggest inspiration beyond the topics that we listed in the call for paper. Next, please, Rebekah. So now more practicalities. So these are the JBR submission guidelines. So I will just mention them briefly. And the most important is the dates, right? Which I'm sure a lot of you are very keen to know. So the submission portal will open on October 1st. And that's when you can officially start submitting to the special issue. There will be in the Manuscript Central, there will be an option to choose to submit your manuscript into the special issue. It will be listed in there. The deadline is November 30th, so you have that a couple of months there to get your paper into the system. They will all be managed through the editorial manager. And here it's very important to highlight, we cannot process papers via email. All the papers will need to go through the system, and they will all follow the JBR double-blind review process. So this will be handled with a very big help from the JBR editors who have been super helpful so far and very keen on the success of this special issue. And they will be handling the back end of the process along with us as guest editors. Next, please, Rebekah. Thank you. And here's again some of the guidelines. The overall idea is that the submissions for this special issue will follow the same guidelines as the format for any articles you would usually submit to JBR. So there's nothing different here. This is from the JBR website, but just to kind of give you a bit of an idea. So 45 double-spaced pages. I know that's one of the main things that I look for the first thing I'm about to submit an article. So the length of the article, the formatting, the fonts are all listed as well on the website. There needs to be an abstract, and the abstract for JBR is not a structured abstract. So again, please follow the typical kind of article format for JBR. The table and references at the end. There's kind of a little bit more details about what needs to go into which page of the manuscript, and typically by the final accepted manuscript, they usually are a little bit on the shorter side, so 8,000 words, all inclusive of everything. But that is giving room to the revision process and how the review process goes. And these are general guidelines. Again, you will find more details about what needs to go where and all the details about how to format the tables and the guidelines and the references on the website. And I included the link here below for you as well. Next, Rebekah, please. Thank you. And with that, we kind of end the official part of the workshop. At this point, we'd like to kind of open it up for questions. We included our emails in there. And as Rebekah and Sertan mentioned, this is being recorded. So all the slides along with the call for papers and the recording will be shared on SERVSIG a YouTube channel, and we hope also to be included in the newsletter. So if you missed it in the YouTube channel, you can always see it as a news article in the newsletter. But for now, we'd like to open it for questions and answer any questions you might have on what we presented, or general questions you might have about specific ideas you might want to share with us.